imagine, or we try to imagine what it must be like, what she would have gone through as a little girl at that time, barely
Mm.
learned to speak anyway before that happened. In the next, I don't know, the next 4 or 5 years, one or both of her sisters managed to communicate with her by having little home related things which kind of broke through in communication terms. But if things were not getting any better, so in about 1886, when she would have been 7 or 8, her mother saw an article by Charles Dickens called
Mm.
American Notes, and it was about the story of a woman, young woman, teenager, I think, called Laura Bridgman, who was blind and deaf, and she had had a successful education, as outlined in this story by Charles Dickens, of all people. So the mother, Helen's mother, contacted the publishers, etc. She in turn was referred to, I think, the Perkins Institute for the Blind, something like that. And she went along. The parents both went along with Helen and discussed things. They suggested she contacted another outlet in Baltimore, and there was a connection there with, of all people, Alexander Graham Bell, who actually features strangely in one of my songs,
All
because
right.
Alexander Graham Bell, the man who invented the telephone, of course.
Wow.
Anyway, he then put them in touch with somebody at the school which was related to this Laura Bridgman. And the school then recommended a lady called, who was about 20 then, a
Mm.
lady called Anne Sullivan, because they felt she could, they hoped, successfully penetrate the fog, the silence, the blackness for poor Helen, and actually try to give her an education. And that she did. So when she started, she basically gave Helen things to hold. For example, one of the early things was a mug, like my mug here, coffee mug. And she tried to then, with her fingers on Helen's hand, tried to spell mug, to give her different letters. It's difficult to explain how she did that, but obviously she decided on this way, which had been used on the previous young lady, Laura Bridgman.
Mm.
And at first, Helen got dreadfully upset, and she actually broke the mug in anger at one stage. But then she said, a little bit later, quite early on, Anne put Helen's hand under a tap of water, faucet, as they say in America, under a tap of water. And the water was just coming down gently on her hand. And under this system that she was trying to introduce to Helen, she spelled out the words water, the letters water, Water. And it was like it was an epiphany. And Helen herself said in her autobiography that suddenly, she said, it was wonderful. There was a breakthrough. I realized that what was this beautiful liquid coming on my hand had a name, and then she related it. And she said it was the birthday of her soul. That was her phrase, because she felt she was communicating. She was remembering previous thoughts she had. I mean, this gets into a very complicated area, trying to understand just how this Anne Sullivan penetrated. And actually, they became friends for life. I say for life. Um, Anne Sullivan, she died in 1935. I think she would have been about 60, something like that. But you know what? The incredible thing about this story, which isn't always known, is that when Anne Sullivan was a little girl, she had trachoma, which is an eye disease, and she lost most of her eyesight. And indeed, it was constantly deteriorating. So indeed, it was constantly deteriorating. So that when she started to teach Helen in about 1986, 87,
Mm.
she could barely see herself. And as I say, a few years later, I forget how old she was, but 4 or 5 years later, she lost her sight completely. So can you imagine that teaching a blind, deaf, and mute child, and yet she was effectively blind herself. I mean, the mind
Wow.
boggles at the human spirits, how people can do these incredible things. But to just go on a little bit about Helen Keller, she wrote her autobiography in 2000 in 1903. So she was born in 1880, so she would have been 23. And actually, I don't know whether you can see it there, but
Yeah.
it's a very thin book. That's her autobiography. It is the
Oh.
most magnetic book. You can't put it down when you start reading it. It's her story of how she dealt with this incredible illness, which, incidentally, some doctors nowadays think it was either meningitis that she had, or it could have been scarlet fever, because that was a very dangerous illness in those days as well. But anyway, Helen wrote that book. And to sort of cut a long story short, in her lifetime, and she died in 1968, so she would have been 88, but she wrote 14 books. She traveled the world lecturing on and speaking up for blind people, blind deaf people, and all those handicaps. And she was a great advocate, raising millions of pounds in America and abroad for those causes. She was a fantastic woman, and as I say, an incredible example of what the human spirit can do. I think sometimes we all have our issues in life, our problems, and we think, oh, I can't be doing that, it's too difficult, or we don't really think we're good enough to do something, or we don't trust ourselves, and we hold back. But I think the truth is, we don't ever really find out what we've got, how we can cope, until and unless we're under pressure. We've got our backs against the wall. I think a lot of people have said, not much good comes out of the comfort zone. We all tend to want to stay in our comfort zones. But what stories like Helen Keller's tells me and tells us, I think, is we've really got to reach out. In her talks around the world and in her books, there's not a trace of self-pity, of I've had it tough, whatever. This woman was blind and deaf and dumb, but she learned to speak. Her only regret was that she felt she couldn't speak quite properly, and she felt sorry for the audiences. But I mean, they could understand what she was saying. But what an incredible story of this woman, and I just would advocate it. There's a